College, Prescott campus. She received her master's degree from California State University, Chico, and she specializes in postmodernism and feminist critical theory. On that note, please welcome Brandelyn.
Hello, good morning. Just to fix this so it's not. All right, thank you all for coming out this morning. I would also like to thank Debbie Roberts and Dr. Amy Stein, the co-coordinators of the Interdisciplinary Symposium, for their invitation to participate in what I think is a very fascinating and intellectually stimulating event. I would also like to thank the Friends of Yavapai College Art for allowing this lecture to be held in conjunction with their Art a la carte lecture series. This is actually my second year participating in these interdisciplinary symposiums. And it's also my second year talking about war-based imagery. Last year I spoke on the photography of the Civil War. I found this year's invitation, though, to be a little bit more challenging for me, because the reactions to the First War, or the Great War, were so much more varied and numerous and immediate. And the time itself was just so much more complex than it was when the Civil War was fought 50 years earlier. And so one of the things I found that made it so complex was this idea that war isn't just fighting. It isn't just politics. It irrevocably affects society, it affects culture, and it affects people. And when it affects people on an individual level, it does so in ways that are really intense and really impersonal, or very personal. And I think that that's what we're going to see this morning at the art that we're going to be looking at, although we really are only going to be looking at a limited view of a more wider and complex picture. So before we move on, just a couple of things. We are looking at war-based imagery, so there may be images that we're going to see that might be a little uncomfortable. I just want to forewarn you. Also, too, I would like to ask if we could please hold questions till the end of the presentation. I do have a tendency to go off on tangents, and we do have a very tight time together here. So if we do run out of time, which may be a possibility, I can address questions individually out in the lobby after the presentation. Okay, so let's begin. I hope this works. Dwight? I have to turn it on. Sorry about that. I didn't think about the mechanics of the presentation. Okay, here we go. All right, so before we start looking at artwork, I thought it might be useful to kind of look at a very brief historical context that surrounded the production of these artworks. When we think about the World War I, most historians agree that there was a series of events that led up to the outbreak of the war, and that essentially these events caused for increasing international tensions, and it created this global conflict that was literally like simmering until, you know, the explosion, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. And once that assassination happens, the war breaks out shortly thereafter. Historians differ, though, on placing levels of importance on these series of events. When I interpret the history, I really, instead of looking at these events, look at the root causes. And I find that there are two of them that are related, and that is industrialization and colonization. So industrialization begins in Britain in the 1780s, but the term Industrial Revolution isn't popularized until the 1820s, when people really started to feel its effects. And what caused the Industrial Revolution, or helped to sort of bring it about, were things like increased population, there were agricultural innovations, and then we start to see the establishment of world trade. Now, related, in my mind, very inseparable, is colonialization. So colonialization does help to establish these trade markets, these global trade markets, but also, more importantly, colonized lands had all of these very valuable raw materials with a readily available workforce through slaves who would, collect the raw materials, and they would be sent back to industrial sites for processing. I find colonization very important because this created a lot of conflict and a lot of competition among nations. And so they were competing with one another to grab up these lands that had these valuable materials and the readily available labor. Now, in my mind, the Industrial Revolution is one of the most important events in all of humanity's history, and that's because this event imposed so much change, and this happened rather quickly in the grand scheme of things. And even this, you could see, would contribute to this climate of tension that we have in Europe, because humans, we are creatures of habit. We don't like change. It makes us uncomfortable, especially if these changes are happening rather quickly and to such an extensive level. And it was indeed rather extensive. There was not a facet of life that the Industrial Revolution did not affect. Culturally, socially, politically, economically, family, demographics. The effects really were very wide-reaching. And of course, if we're going to talk about the effects, it also affected warfare practices. Now, the Industrial Revolution was not, or excuse me, the First World War was not the first war to be fought in the industrialized age. That actually was the Civil War. However, this is the first war where we have the effects of industrialization most painfully and most obviously felt. We have things like the development of mechanized weapons, brutally effective war machines like tanks and planes. All of these things allowed for an increased potential to inflict damage. Also, it allowed for many more casualties and many more injuries. And just for example, in the 4-year period that the war was fought, you have 10 million people killed and 20 million people injured. Now, if we want to look at these statistics from a different viewpoint, every single day that the war was fought, that would be 7,000 people that were killed in one day, every single day for 4 years, or 14,000 people every single day for 4 years that were injured. And this statistic that I have given you does not even account whatsoever for the psychological injuries that came from the war. So with all of this death and violence and destruction, you would think that people would be really united in their response to the war, that people would be horrified by it, and everybody would be against the war. But even with this brief historical context I've given you, you can see that this is a really complicated time, and that therefore the responses to the war were very complicated as well. So with this in mind, I chose two modern styles, Dada and Futurism, and these are both styles that arose in direct response to the First World War. However, the style of Dada was anti-war, as we would expect, but the style of Futurism was actually pro-war. They were in favor of this war being fought. Now, with both of these styles, we're seeing them emerge out of this desire that people had to respond. This war was so personal and it was so intense to people that people felt compelled to speak out and to react and to participate in the dialogues, although they were doing so in different ways. And so, for example, we have this piece here by Hannah Hawk, and this is much more of a commentary on the political and the cultural climate of Germany at the time, where a work like, for example, here with Boccioni's, this is much more of a direct reference to war, as we might come to expect to see during this time. So we'll start out then with the style of Dada. So the idea behind Dada, the artists believed that it was rationality and logic that had caused the First World War. So our only route to salvation would be to embrace the intuitive, the irrational, the nonsensical. Therefore, absurdity is the cornerstone to Dada art, absurdity. And even something like the name Dada, what does this even mean, Dada? And actually, we don't even really know what that means. There's some possibilities. One possibility is nothing, that it's just random sounds, da, 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 da. Another possibility is that it could be in reference to a sort of casual way to refer to in French to a child's hobby horse called a dada. And then another possibility was that there was this conversation being had in Romanian between these two artists, and they kept saying yes, which is da. So in the conversation, they were like da, 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 and someone overheard that, and that became the name of the style. Again, that's kind of a confusing name for a style. That's the whole point. Another issue with the Dada style was that they did not want to be classified as such. They did not want to be considered a style because that would denote a certain level of cohesion and a certain level of rationality. They did not want to be bound to common visual characteristics. They wanted to do their own thing, say what they wanted to say, however they wanted to say it, using the materials that spoke to them. And so this is actually a very challenging style for us to look at in retrospect, because we don't have that cohesion that helps us to better understand what, as a group, these people are trying to say. Now, there are some commonalities that we can see in this style, and one of them is that there seems to be a relative level of hostility that exists among these artists in terms of being hostile towards the established way of doing things. And we see this particularly when it comes to arts traditions. And so if you look at this pair of images here, you can kind of see a little bit of all of this in these two works of art. So these are by the artist Marcel Duchamp. And what we have is we have with the fountain, it's a urinal. It's a urinal that's been turned on its side, and it's simply being presented as fine art. And then over here with LHOOQ, we have this cheap print of the Mona Lisa that he's come in and he's painted onto a mustache and a goatee. So if we think about this notion of absurdity, for a lot of people, this was absurd. I mean, how does it make sense that a urinal is an example of fine art? How does it make sense that Mona Lisa with a mustache is art? And of course, there is nothing at all that relates to arts traditions in these two works of art at all. And even this idea of hostility, you could interpret that as well. I mean, he's taking one of the most celebrated icons of feminine beauty and turning her into this sort of like androgynous, person. And he's defacing the image, essentially. Or he's taking this receptacle for urine and putting it out and just saying this is art. And I think you can interpret a little bit of, hostility in these acts. Another thing that makes Dada complicated for us to understand as a style is that it was international. So the style originates in 1916 in Zurich, Switzerland, and it's probably originating in Switzerland because this was a neutral area. So they have the cultural and the political permissiveness to allow for art production that's going to criticize war. And they don't have as much concern for things like censorship as the Dada artists in Germany had. And many art historians say that it is in Switzerland that we see the most innovative approaches to the Dada style occurring. Now, the other major site of production of Dada work was in Berlin, Germany. The work that comes out of Berlin is much different because it's much more political, and that has to do with the political climate. In Germany, prior to and during the war, there was a fair amount of collusion between the government, the military, and the business people in ways that were not at all advantageous to the wider German public. So when you look at Dada art from Berlin, it tends to be very resentful, and you can detect, a sense of anger and protest. Now, there was also a lesser site of Dada art production in Cologne, Germany as well. We also have Dada work being produced in Paris, France, which tends to be the most negative and scathing of the Dada art being produced. And then finally, way over here, we have a site of production in New York. Now, the New York approach to Dada is much different in character than its European counterparts. Part of that has to do, and I think you can just see here on the map, there's a fair amount of geographical isolation. Another part of this, though, is the fact that the United States joins the war late in 1917. So they're isolated from the war in that respect, too. And so if I can go back for a minute, these images, although by the French artist Marcel Duchamp, they are affiliated with New York Dada. And so what you see with New York Dada is that they are talking about these ideas of absurdity and anti-tradition, but they're not quite as overtly about war as the other images that we're going to be looking at. Now, the style of Dada begins in Switzerland, as I said, and many believe that the style officially begins with the performance art of Hugo Ball. This idea of art as performance was really cutting edge. Nobody had ever seen something like this before, and there was certainly no precedence or tradition for this type of expression. What Ball did is he would make costumes. And so for like Cabaret Voltaire, he made these sort of like conical shapes out of cardboard. And then he would stand there and he would recite what he called sound poems, which were these abstract poems that were basically random sounds. And we have an excerpt from Cabaret Voltaire up here at the top. And as you can see, this makes no sense. But it does make sense if you think about it, because think about language. Language is very rational. It's very structured. There's all these rules, surrounding language, which we know, because Dada is all about absurdity, they're completely rejecting. And they're doing so by having these random sound poems. And, if we can be honest with one another here, I mean, this looks and sounds pretty ridiculous. He looks like a cross between a chef and a lobster. But the point is it's supposed to be like that. Ball is trying to achieve, and I quote, buffoonery and spontaneous foolishness. That's the whole point. And you know what? This stuff was so weird, and it was so out there, but it was so innovative that it got people's attention. This stuff was being performed publicly in, public theaters. It was not in the privacy of a museum or a gallery, and it was provocative. And so it got people thinking about war, about nationalism, about tradition. And it's surprising to me that out of such ridiculous and tomfoolery, that we actually have some very meaningful insight that is being produced that's really, some very effective commentary on the state of affairs in Europe at the time. Now, another major component of the Dada style is chance, this idea of allowing whatever is going to happen. And it's kind of like Ball with his random sound poems. So the work of Jean Arp starts out as synthetic cubist in style. And this style cubism was super cutting edge at the time, but the Dada artists didn't like it because it was very institutionalized. They also didn't like it because cubism was based on rationality, analysis, and we know that they do not like that at all. They reject it. So the story behind this piece is Jean Arp is making this collage in the Cubist style. He's thinking, he's being rational, he's analyzing. He gets so frustrated that he just throws it all on the floor. And then he looks down and says, oh, this actually is a pretty good work of art. I'm just going to put it up like this. Now, I'm a little suspicious. This is a little too conveniently grid-like to just randomly have fallen on the floor. But the idea is still, I think, very potent if you think about the implications that come with really what he's doing. So he throws all of this on the floor, and by putting it as a work of art, he's rejecting these traditions that we assume that artists are genius and they're talented, right? Because anybody could do this. And so, we also, if you look at this, is also approaching it from a very impersonal way. There's nothing really personal in terms of expression. He seems to be rejecting these very romanticized ways that artists tend to express emotion. There's also, I think, a certain level of chaos, this idea that you throw things on the floor and then it makes this work of art. And chaos, I think, is very appropriate when we consider that we are looking at, a time of warfare. And even this idea of spontaneity, this idea of just allowing whatever to happen, speaks to this sort of rejection of control. And again, this idea of not wanting to be controlled, I think, is also appropriate when we're considering this time period. Now, the work of Raoul Houseman, he's most well known for making these 3D collages out of found objects. And he did so in a way that was really similar to Marcel Duchamp with his urinal and his print of the Mona Lisa. Although you can see with Houseman's work, it's much more manipulated than Duchamp's work. And for Houseman, what he's trying to do, and he tends to talk a lot about this in his work, is talk about this idea of the grotesque. And he likes to present these more caricaturized representations of humanity. Houseman's big fear that he saw is he saw that the modern experience, as punctuated by industrialization, was really dehumanizing people, especially as he saw more and more people start to work in factories. He felt that humans were being reduced down to these more impersonal notions of sort of functionality. He became more and more concerned about this as he started to see injured people returning home from the war. And as I said, industrialization caused increased casualties with warfare. So tons and tons of soldiers are coming home from the war wounded. And this was very visible to Houseman as well as to the other people in Europe at the time. And in fact, the injuries that people sustained in the First World War were so severe that the field of facial plastic surgery emerges during World War I in response to this need to fix people up so that they could be integrated back into society and back into the workforce. And so what would happen is when people would come back from the war and they were not able to be fixed through surgery, doctors would collaborate with artists, people like Anna Coleman Ladd, to make facial masks, and they'd put the masks over the injuries. Initially, these masks were made of metal, galvanized copper, and then they would paint on with oil paint to make it have a more lifelike quality. Now, these masks were meant to help the soldiers, and they were meant to help society, but in many ways, they actually hurt the soldiers and it hurt society because people felt really uncomfortable looking at people walking around with partially metal faces. And so what happened is very quickly, these facial masks became symbols of the war being so horrific. And people like Raoul Houseman picked up on this anxiety, and they used it and exploited it in their art very effectively. So if you look at his mechanical head here, there's this really clear view of artificiality, and there's this sort of fragmentation. And you can see how fragmentation and artificiality would speak to this notion of dehumanization. And in fact, this became such a point for people, these people walking around with metal faces, that what started to happen is they began to display the casts of the injured soldiers' faces. Here's an example of a display here, the injured faces as well as the masks. And people came in droves, almost like a tourist attraction, to look at these faces and really take in the horrors of war. Now, from our standpoint, this might seem a little bit problematic because there certainly is this undertone of entertainment here. But there is a historical precedence for this. During the Civil War, the same thing happened, where people flocked in droves to look at photographs of dead soldiers' bodies laying out on the battlefield. So we move now to the style of futurism. And when World War I broke out, Italy was relatively new to the political stage as an autonomous nation. They had only achieved nationhood in the relatively recent year of 1861. Shortly after that, they try their hand at colonialism in Africa, and this boosts their national confidence and their sense of patriotism. Another thing that gave them a little bit of a boost was that they were having an industrial revolution of their own, which was allowing them to catch up economically and technologically with Germany and Britain and France, who had been ahead of them in this respect for about 100 years. Now, futurism as a style originates in Italy and it stays in Italy. It does not have the international character that Dada had. And with the futurists, they're very much thinking about the modern experience as it's dictated by industrialization. They're really focused on things like movement and speed and energy and aggression, progress. And they're very much focused on technology because they see that technology is helping to bring about these things. And so if you look at a work here, like this one here by Boccioni, you can kind of see how they're trying to communicate this, that this is a very dynamic work of art. They put in a lot of like diagonal lines, that they're dynamic, they cut through the composition, they give this sense of energy and thrust. There's a really nice interaction, an energetic interaction between color and form. And then, of course, we do have our reference to technology with the numbers here that's meant to be a sort of abstract representation of a train. The main idea behind futurism is they felt like Italy was in this time of intellectual and cultural decline. And the only way to remedy this decline would be through war. They advocated war because they thought that war would destroy everything, and then they could rebuild anew. And it would allow them to shed the constraints of the past. Now, this idea of shedding the constraints of the past is important because this was a big sticking point with the futurists. They felt like Italian art was really only acknowledged for its celebrated past, particularly the art that was produced during ancient Rome and the art that was produced during the Italian Renaissance. And so they felt that even in the present, that Italian art was stuck there, that the artists kept looking to the past, they weren't making art of the present. And they were looking at other forms of art being produced in Europe, particularly Cubism in France, again, this very cutting edge style, and it was making them feel like they were left behind. However, this is ironic because if you look at this example here, this sculpture by Boccioni, this is probably the most well-known work to be produced from the futurist style. This is like the poster child of futurism. But if you compare this work to our Greek classical example over here on the right, the irony is this piece by Boccioni is obviously influenced by the very type of classical art that they're trying to turn their back on. You can see that with both of these images, there's a concern with movement. There's a sense of action. There's this barely constrained sense of energy, which is all things that the futurists are trying to focus on. But I also like this comparison because I think it shows us very specifically how the futurists are trying to move past classical Roman art. And you can see that in terms of material, the more industrial material of metal rather than stone. You can see it through subject matter, where this looks like a soldier versus a goddess, mythological figure. And you can see it as well in abstract representation. Instead of a relatively realistic view of human form, here it's broken up and it's faceted, which kind of helps to give it that sense of motion and movement. Now, the name futurism is kind of misleading because you would expect to be seeing all these images of the future. But what we really see as the most common subject matter in futurism is the present, and more specifically, the sort of everyday, mundane aspects of the present, and of course, a rejection of the past. And I think maybe like a more appropriate style name would probably be like presentism, because that's all we see. And they do depict technology and look at technology quite frequently in futurist art, but it's the technology of the present. It's not dreams or predictions of technology for the future. And so when I think about this idea of engaging with the everyday, I actually think this is very powerful for a couple of reasons. First of all, this does help the futurists shed the constraints of the past as they're trying to do. Because there's really nothing here that you look at that you could relate to Roman classicism or Italian Renaissance. It's not heroic, like we would expect to see coming out of ancient Rome. And it's not intellectual, or at least immediately apparently intellectual, as we would expect to see from the Italian Renaissance. The other thing that's really powerful, I think, about engaging with the everyday is this is a message that's available to everyone. You don't have to be a member of the intellectual elite to understand what's going on here. I think we all understand the implications of walking a dog. And I think it's also communicating this message that revolution, which is what the futurists sought, that it could happen from the ground up, that even when you're walking your dog, that could be a potentially revolutionary activity. So Bala takes this, everyday mundane act of walking your dog, and he reduces it down to its dynamic essence by repeating the form. And so again, we have this very typical futurist exploration of motion and movement, where it appears as though this figure is walking purposefully and very quickly as the dog and the owner are walking. I would also say, too, that with this replication of form to this extent, that there is an agitated quality to this piece as well that probably is a reflection of wider anxieties of the time. Now, photography had a very important yet contentious relationship with futurism. It was important because this type of artwork, this medium, photography, was better positioned than even painting or sculpture to truly investigate the futurist aims. And that's because the photographs were taken with a camera, a mechanical tool, the very type of technology that the futurists were trying to celebrate. The contentious part was that photography was not considered to be an appropriate medium for the futurist style. It was seen as being inferior to painting. And this was nothing new. I mean, people had felt that photography was inferior ever since its development about 80 years prior. So this is not something that was specific to the futurists. And surprisingly, the most vocal critic of photography with futurism was Boccioni. And he said basically it just was no good, it just didn't fit in with what the futurists were trying to do. Now, if you look at this photograph, it's kind of hard to see where Boccioni's coming from on this, because this very much fits the futurist agenda. There is this sense of movement and action. There's a level of aggression. Futurist works tend to be rather masculine, and you can see this in this image. Here's another one. So the artist of these photographs, Bragaglia, and he oftentimes collaborated with his brother Arturo, called these photodynamics. And the idea behind photodynamics is they take the film and they would expose it to light for an extended period of time. While the film was exposed, the subject of the photograph would move, and that movement would be recorded in the film. The idea behind the photodynamics was it was meant to capture a world in flux, to reflect the modern experience, where things are always changing, they're always different. The subject matter is typical futurist. It's everyday, it's mundane, it's nothing special. Again, that level of aggression and masculinity. And as with Boccioni, you can see that Bragaglia is looking at this idea of the trajectory of motion, how the body displaces as it moves through space. And dare I say, I think Bragaglia actually is more effective at capturing this idea of movement and energy than Boccioni was. And maybe that was the issue. Maybe Boccioni was just jealous that Bragaglia was able to achieve this thing that he was trying so hard to achieve through both painting and sculpture. Whatever the outcome, whatever the reason why, in the end, Boccioni is very effective, and the Bragaglia brothers end up being expelled from the futurist group. So, in the end, we're left with this style that was almost like a cheery advocate of war, because they felt like war was simply part of the dynamic modern experience. And of course, war had this potential to be a cleansing mechanism, to allow for Italy to grow anew, to allow for this optimistic vision that these young futurist artists had to come to fruition. The futurists were looking to the future, excited about what the present had to offer. This idea that life didn't have to be boring and static and predictable, but that modernity brought instead change and excitement, things always being different, experiences that were new, and that technology allowed for this as well. Life was more efficient, and you could experience new and different things. However, looking at an image like this, the irony of championing war is becoming very apparent. This painting is celebrating an innovation that was made possible by industrialization. There's this armored train that has a huge cannon on it that drives around shooting people, and then the soldiers could stand in and shoot more people too. So we're apparently looking at this moment of armed conflict, and it's not being presented in a negative way. Again, we have that futurist focus on energy, and it's dynamic, all of our diagonal lines. The color palette is a lot more brighter and a bit sort of cheerier. And what's most interesting to me is that we really are only seeing in this image part of it all. Because look at what's going on outside of the composition. We have all of these guns and cannons that are shooting, but the artist is not showing who is on the receiving end of these bullets in the cannon and what that effect is going to be. So what becomes very clear to me is that the futurists are celebrating war, but they're really looking at it in a more theoretical way. They're really not acknowledging the true reality of war. That if you get hit, you know, what happens if you get hit by a cannon or by guns? The idea that war kills people, that it's painful, that it's traumatic. Those things are not depicted in futurist art. The other thing that indicates to me is that they're looking at things on a more theoretical level is, for example, Boccioni, you know, the main proponent of futurism that we've been looking at this morning. This guy was so vocal about the great things that war could do, how war could change Italy, and that very war kills him. At the age of 33, he is killed in World War I. The very youth that the futurists prized being cut short through this armed conflict. So when I started putting this lecture together, what really kind of kept coming up in my mind was this idea of complexity, that the time itself was very complex, the reactions to the war were very complex. And one of the things that spoke most clearly to me about this idea of complexity was that I realized rather quickly that I had to rework all of my initial assumptions regarding this topic. When I started working on this, it was my assumption that because Dada was anti-war and futurism was pro-war, that these styles were on the complete opposite ends of the artistic, the stylistic, the conceptual spectrums, that they would be so different that there would be no room whatsoever for any sort of overlap, any sort of commonality. And that proved to actually be incorrect. And what I realized is that you cannot, with so many things in life, really look at things in these black and white, sort of neat binary categories. It's more complex than that. And so even though these seem so oppositional, they actually aren't, to the extent that much of what Dada did took its cues from what futurism did. So like, for example, with both of these styles, they had their origins in performance. So we already know about Hugo Ball, we talked about him earlier, but actually futurism started in the same way, performance. Futurism started as a literary movement, more specifically poetry, and the visual arts came along later. At the very beginning of the futurist style, the performance aspect would be people would stand up and with random sounds, interestingly similar to Ball, with random sounds, they would recite the manifestos of the style. And the manifestos were basically the documents that kind of laid out what futurism was all about. So their performance would be to, recite these with random sounds in the background. And almost always at the end, it would be concluded with a fight or a big brawl. And they actually liked that. They liked the fact that people got so, heated up about things that they began to physically fight at the end. It's part of what futurism liked, this idea of violence and aggression. With both of these styles, they both were plagued by the doubts of the time. They both were rebellious. With both these styles, they had this antagonistic bent to them. And with both of these styles, they sought cultural and intellectual change. And in the end, the change that they sought, it did come about. the work was effective, and people did see it and they did respond to it. And in many ways, there was a change in thought. In many ways, there was an intellectual transformation. However, these changes and these new mindsets, they only lasted for a certain time. The impact was only so far-reaching because just 21 short years later, humanity finds itself once again involved in global conflict with the outbreak of World War II. Thank you. So we do have time for questions, which is great if anyone has them. Anyone have any questions? John?
You know, I find it funny that the futuristic painting with the dog set, they went kind of back to a similar form of pointillism to express it. I mean, if you're going to vanish from the past, you know, to show your movement, that's kind of pointillistic, isn't it?
John, you are right on the mark. You know why? Because this is interesting. The origins of futurism in terms of style, heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by pointillism. That's the stylistic origin. So well done in pointing that out. It's not till they are exposed to cubism that we start to see a significant change. But definitely, it does speak to the stylistic influences of the early part of the style. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. American Dada artists. Yes, there are. I'm trying to think who. When we talk about Dada art, we tend to sort of marginalize American artists because we're seeing that the more sort of potent and more sort of, I think, I don't want to say relevant, but I kind of do want to say that, is coming out of Europe. And actually, I'm kind of at a loss to think of a well-known American Dada artist, because really it's just, in terms of America, when we look at Dada art production, it's Tristan Tzara and it's Duchamp. And other than that, there's really not any like worthwhile American artists. What's happening is this, I'll tell you this. A lot of artists from Europe are coming over to America to avoid the war. But what's happening in American art at this time is they're very much entrenched in traditional, more realistic forms. And so a lot of American artists did not embrace the Dada style. And in fact, there was quite a bit of derision, and it was especially Duchamp who was widely ridiculed by American artists. And so I just don't think that American artists were kind of ready yet to embrace these more avant-garde approaches. That doesn't happen until the Second World War, and then American art completely changes from then. Other questions? Yes?
Similarly, I'm curious about Germany and whether they allow their Dada artists to survive, should I say, or to work?
Yeah, so German art is a particular situation because there was this political climate that they had to be very cautious in as they maneuvered. Lots and lots of censorship. And so a lot of German art tends to be a little bit more sort of toned down than what you would see coming out of Paris, for example. And so it wasn't, not a lot of it was really viewed as being a threat. Like even, for example, like the mechanical head, you know, this wasn't something that the German, you know, government was having huge issues with. And we really don't see government acknowledging the true power of art until, in Germany at least, until we get to the Second World War. And then we all know that Hitler kind of, you know, destroys a bunch of things. And yes, a lot of the Dada art from the First World War, that was a target of Hitler's. But a lot of that just had to do with the fact that it went outside of the artistic norms that he felt was appropriate for art, which was pretty much this sort of thing, the Nike of Samothrace. Yes?
My dates are very hazy, but I'm wondering whether the collaborations between Diaghilev, Stravinsky, Picasso, does that fit in with any of this, or is that a later period?
Can you repeat the names, please?
Diaghilev, the ballet, the visual arts, the music, the bit like Firebird, is that the 20s or?
Well, I have to be honest with you. When you step outside of art, I don't know as much. So I can't be certain. Those names aren't familiar to me, but I can tell you this. With Dada, this style very much was not just painting or sculpture or tradition. It was everything. It was dance, it was poetry, it was spoken word, it was architecture. I mean, it was photography. It was anything at all that you could express. That was fair game for Dada. And so even though I'm not really familiar with these outside of art names that you're saying, I think it's probable because we see such a multitude of expressions. And it really was more of like a mindset rather than a style. And so it is very far-ranging in that respect. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm curious, how did he die?
Okay, it's kind of random, but he fell off a horse and he hit his head. But it was during some sort of altercation that happened. Yeah. And I think it's sad. I mean, even though Boccioni is kind of like a little bit of a bully, he certainly was like this guy who's kind of egotistical. He was really talented. And I just think that it's really sad to have lost the potential of what this guy could have done. Yes?
His styles seem to bracket the war. They preceded, they continued through the war, and they lasted for a time after the war. I guess, coming here, I guess I was expecting something to show how the art community responded to the experience of the war. But this suggests to me something more about zeitgeist, something, for lack of a better word, a spiritual crisis that explains the war more than the war explains anything else.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely zeitgeist. And you know what's interesting? You say that notion of spirituality, because that was actually something that kind of surprised me as I was putting this together and doing some research. That there is this kind of spiritual focus that they have. Even something like Dada, which was so like ridiculous and so nonsensical that some of these artists did turn to these more kind of like metaphysical or spiritual ideas to help kind of guide it. And one of the things that we see with the art of World War I, and this goes beyond simply futurism or Dada, the response is very extensive, and there's a multitude of styles. I mean, I just picked two because that was, time limitations. We don't really see a lot of artists outright depicting war. It's not really what they're focused on. Most of the artists, most of the styles are focused again on the time, the spirit of the times, how this affects humanity. You don't see, aside from futurism, which we did see a couple of images at the very beginning here, of straight out war. That's not what they're depicting. It's not a common subject matter, which is interesting because you think that it would be, but really it's not. They're more looking at the implications of war on humanity. And I believe the reason why is because people were already, artists at least, up in arms about industrialization. They were already kind of investigating that zeitgeist. And so it just kind of was a continuation of investigating the climate rather than the specific cause for the climate. There really is very few images, direct images of war produced during this time period, except for maybe documentary photography. Yes? That's a good question, everyday man. And I'm glad you asked that question because another commonality between these two styles was the fact that this was for the everyday man. And so one of the things that's always been an issue with art is this accusation of cultural elitism, this idea that these works are enshrined in these sacred spaces, that the everyday man doesn't get to access, or if we can access it, we don't get it. And so these were all very concerned with the everyday man seeing them. And so, you know, something like this was for us. This wasn't for the cultural elite. And so people could understand this. Hugo Ball has his performance art in public theater spaces where the everyman could go. And they did present these publicly in places that were accessible, smaller galleries that, you know, were located in neighborhoods and things like that, so that people could see that, because that was the whole point for Dada and Futurism, is to reach the everyman, because it was from the everyman that they could truly incite change through art. So people did see it, and that's why I said at the end that these things were effective, because of that visibility that you don't often see with art. Yes, Paul.
As you were looking at these images from Dada and Futurism, did any images from, say, the 1950s or the 1960s or later modern art come to mind? Another way of stating the question is, how did Futurism and or Dada influence modern art down the road?
That's a good question. And you know, when you're talking about like the 50s and the 60s, we're looking at like post-World War II and sort of the residual artistic responses that came from that. Interestingly, what happens is when the Second World War breaks out, art takes this very interesting turn where we really kind of just like reject everything. And so like Jackson Pollock, the famous guy that has splatters everywhere, you know, that's the kind of thing that's starting to emerge. And so we can look certainly from like a technical, you know, sort of influence where a lot of this stuff remains in terms of artists beginning to reject representation. Again, because they just want to turn their backs on everything, you know, at that point. Also makes me think of things like European figurative art that also is post-World War II, and that's very similar to this in that it's just these very sort of immediate, personal, visceral responses to conflict. And so if you're talking about kind of how this sets up for future reactions to the war, you can see it both in terms of you know, the technical approach of sort of rejecting reality for more abstract views, as well as really personal communications of reaction. And even something like the drip paintings of Pollock, you look at what does that even mean? Actually, those are really intense emotional outputs, not necessarily for war, but kind of just like the human psyche and responding to the things that happen around you. And so this does, in many ways, you know, cement this foundation that does play out when we have war being produced during and after the Second World War.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes? Okay.
How large is it? Was it bronze? What size was the other?
Yeah, they're not comparable in size. So of course, Niki of Samothrace is like huge. But the Umberto Boccioni's work, if I just set it on the ground, it would be about that tall. Yeah. There's actually, there's multiple copies of this sculpture that exist. I think around 5 of them. And I actually recently saw one of these. Where was I? I was somewhere and I saw it. I want to say, I mean, I just, you know, you look at so much, but I did just recently see one, and I want to say that it was like in like Tennessee or somewhere that I saw one of these. And that was pretty cool. It's always cool to see famous works of art in person. Yes, sir.
Just so you in California, in the southern part of the state, not long ago, they used to have a Dada parade.
Really?
Yeah, in Los Angeles, somewhere around Los Angeles, basically. And the theme was to say, goofy.
You know, and it's funny you say that. I'm glad you mentioned that. One thing about Dada is, you know, we're talking about this in the context of World War I. Dada as a style actually lives on. And we see a sort of resurgence of Dada known as like Neo-Dada or Nouveau Realisme And this is coming in like the 70s or so. And so I believe that they would still have Dada parades and things. And I'm from Southern California, so I'm pretty bummed that like I never, saw one of these Dada parades before I relocated to Arizona.
I actually saw one of them, and it was several decades ago. And it was in one of the Santa Monica, somewhere in that part of the state of Florida.
I love it. Yes.
Well, you mentioned that Dada perhaps came from Romania, but then you never mentioned any Romanian works of art. The word, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. That's because we had Tristan Tzara, who was one of the main practitioners of the Dada style, and he was Romanian. So he was speaking with another Romanian artist, Marcel Janco, and that's when they were like, da, 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 da. Actually, we don't have anywhere in Romania as a site of production. And Tristan Tzara, although Romanian, his work that he produced, it was more considered New York Dada, which is along the lines of Marcel Duchamp. And they actually had a really rich collaborative relationship that produced some really interesting artworks. Well, I think that that's about it for the time. If you are an art history student, please make sure that you've signed in for extra credit. And I thank you very much for attending this afternoon.